Hello and welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast on neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We are a group of computational neuroscientists. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And Connor is not with us for this episode, but we have Nancy Padilla, who you may remember from episode 5, our episode on neural oscillations. When she guest hosted with us then, she was a PhD student at Columbia. Nancy, do you want to say hello and tell us what you're up to now?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me back, Grace and Josh. So back when I did episode number 5 or 6, I was still doing my PhD and working with Josh Gordon at Columbia University. Now a postdoc at MIT in the lab of K-Tai, and I'm studying I'm trying to figure out what the neural circuits that underlie social hierarchy are. And I'm really interested in figuring out to what extent mice socialize and how can we measure that.
Okay, thanks. And so that leads us into the topic of this episode, which is social neuroscience. And so Nancy works, as she said, with mice, and a lot of the readings that we chose for today are more human-focused, but it'll be interesting to talk about kind of the contrasting between humans and animals, and especially in this domain of social neuroscience.
Yeah, I have a bias for focusing on things that are common between that exist both in humans and animals, and I also am aware that it's just so much. If you ever if there's something too complex, then it becomes really difficult to decide if animals do it or not, So it's like you cannot say they do not do it, but you cannot say they do it either. So it's like you hit a wall. So you might as well, it is so complex already, you might as well start with simple questions. And I think I don't understand the opposite approach.
So what would be an example where it's obviously too complicated, for example?
Well, empathy, for example. There are some people that have some sort of models of empathy in rat, but I don't know if the empathy is equivalent to the empathy they can record in animals. Is it equivalent to the empathy we feel as humans? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and so are the people who have this kind of model, are they trying to study something like autism? Because I feel like that's usually where, for some reason, it becomes acceptable to claim that animals are similar enough, is when you're using them to study diseases. So there's mouse models of depression and Alzheimer's and all these things that it's not always exactly clear what it means when it's the version of it in the mouse and how it relates to humans.
Yeah, I think, I don't remember that particular study I'm thinking about I'm sure they mentioned social disorder at the introduction of the study. It's possible that even if it's not equivalent to the human version of empathy, it's still interesting on itself if a rat is making a sacrifice for the other rat. So, I mean, perhaps it's not a problem, but to answer that it is or it is not equivalent sounds almost impossible to me, and perhaps not necessary, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It becomes necessary when you want to then be able to do something with humans as a result of the findings in the rodents or whatever other animal. But there always is, I think, reason enough to understand things for their own sake. So we read basically 2 reviews, or I guess they were all 3 reviews, or 2 reviews and an opinion piece or something like that. And so the first one was Conceptual Challenges and Directions for Social Neuroscience, which was written by Ralph Adolphs in 2010. And then the next one was Brain Basis of Human Social Interaction from Concepts to Brain Imaging, and that was by Hari and Kajula in 2009. And the last one was Brain-to-Brain Coupling, a Mechanism for Creating and Sharing a Social World, and that was by Uri Hassan et al. In 2012. And so the first 2 of these kind of offer overviews. The first one in particular, the one by Adolphs, is a lot about the questions behind the field of social neuroscience and a little bit of the history. So we can start by getting into that, one thing to say, I think, is that this is a pretty new field. I mean, neuroscience itself is like a new field by the standards of most of academics and science, but social neuroscience in particular, they say that the phrase was first coined, or it was proposed as a field in 1992. And so this was kind of at the early end of fMRI being a thing. So it was kind of put forth before there was even this boom in brain imaging. And so you can imagine that the ways that you could approach the topic of social neuroscience in humans in particular was pretty limited. But since then, it's taken off.
I mean, I think that the sort of the historical recency of it makes sense when you think about the sort of historical difficulty of even recording from a single brain. So people have studied interactions behaviorally or psychologically between multiple people for a long time, but it's only been relatively recently that people have been able to do, recording, imaging in human and large-scale recordings in animals. And, it's even more technically challenging to be able to do imaging of multiple people or recordings of multiple animals that are interacting. So it's sort of natural that it would be
right.
Even more recent field.
Yeah, I see it that way too. It's like there has been social psychology studies for much longer. Neuroscience is like a baby field, and then it is really technical. It is more than double the trouble, I think, when you're trying to record two brains at once, regardless if it's absolutely. Humans or animal. It's compounding. So I can imagine how people were not even trying to attempt it until very recently.
Yeah, and because most of social neuroscience research actually isn't done with recording multiple brains at once. I think it's been a goal for a long time, but practically speaking, it was difficult. And so in the earlier days, and even now, there's still a lot of social neuroscience is done just using either like one person being recorded and the other person is just interacting with them to kind of provide a stimulus or an input, or even more abstract than that, some of the fMRI studies that are covered in these papers are things like if you have a person try to read and analyze a sentence that involves describing humans, even that can be considered a social stimulus if it's making them think about other humans rather than thinking about inanimate objects.
Or I've heard other kind of clever tricks around this where, for example, you would have an fMRI setting where you record one person while they, for example, read something, and then record another person while they listen to something that the first person read. So it's sort of asynchronously social, but where you're doing only one imaging at a time. And I think sort of you can generalize this kind of logic a bit.
Yeah, and I think one of the early studies where they actually did technically record two people interacting was Montague et al. In 2002, and that setup was two people in fMRI scanners, but they were they said like 1,000 miles apart, right, and interacting via the internet, sending like communication to each other while they were both being recorded. And so obviously, therefore, especially this was in 2002, there was kind of a lag. This wasn't like really proper like face-to-face conversation. I don't know why. I think the fact that they were 1,000 miles apart is supposed to add like flourish to this and make it seem more impressive, but it just is kind of hindering in a way.
Was this a science paper? I think I saw it a long time ago.
I think that's what it was from. I don't actually remember. It was just like briefly cited in one of these papers as one of the early examples of this happening. But yeah, so this idea of comparing across animals and humans, I think, comes up in this field. It seems like there's a sense that there are elements of social neuroscience and kind of social understanding and acting that are unique to humans, or at least people are putting forth the idea that they're unique to humans, and that may explain why a lot of social neuroscience is done in humans. I mean, a lot of different types of neuroscience is done in humans, and it's kind of obvious that we want to understand humans. But certainly, like this Adolph's paper describes these three different categories of social information processing. There's social perception, which is like very immediate kind of sensory perception of facial identification or that kind of thing, or like sensing someone touching you, these kinds of very like bottom-up immediate processes. And then the two other categories, social cognition and social recognition, social regulation is the third one. These are ones that are about understanding other minds, like theory of mind would be an example of social cognition, empathy would be an example from the social cognition category, and then social regulation is things like self-reflection and emotion, regulating your emotions and stuff. And those two categories they posit as being unique to humans. And I don't know what that's based on. I mean, obviously other people would disagree if there's rodent models of empathy and all of that kind of thing. And certainly I would say other primates, there's good evidence for theory of mind-like behavior in other primates. But there is this sense that there is something special, especially about language in humans, that seems relevant to understanding like the place of humans in the world.
Yeah, when people use language as the argument for like, oh, it's unique to humans, then I always wonder, well, what if we haven't figured out, especially recently? Okay, so I work with mice. And when I was in grad school, I pretty much ignored, I knew that mice vocalize, and they vocalize in ultrasonic ranges, but I ignored it. Nobody talked about it in the lab. We didn't really measure it. We were really studying one animal at a time. So it was like, even if they're vocalizing, nobody's hearing, right? But now that I am studying social behaviors in mice, now vocalizations become like a real, well, I really need to care about this, because if I am trying to measure their behavior and record and link that to the neural activity, maybe there is some variability in the neural activity that's actually due to them vocalizing. So now I'm actually starting to record these vocalizations. So anytime someone says like, oh, it's like language is unique to humans, now especially because I am, trying to tackle this new thing of, mice vocalizing to each other. And I'm like, is it unique to humans? Like, I think animals have rudimentary versions of language.
Certainly communication via vocalizations, yeah.
Yeah, that is true.
And I think we read something about this in our episode on brain size, because that's another realm where people want to claim that like humans are unique, or
humans are outliers in some way with respect to the structure or size of their brain relative to other similar animals.
In that one, we covered some stuff about dolphins, and it's known that dolphins have pretty complex vocalizations that transmit complicated information. So it seems like, while I totally understand why you'd want to focus on humans for social neuroscience for a lot of reasons, I don't know that it's fair or even necessary to try to make the claim that there are so many things that are unique to humans here.
Right.
So we can give some examples from these different categories that this first article lays out. And so, as I said, the perceptual ones are like very immediate, and I think there was an effort here to kind of make the point that social signals are kind of as primary and as basic as any other signals. So, which to me was like a somewhat insightful take on the issue, because I think of social neuroscience as being about more higher level abstract things.
Yeah.
But they talk about like pheromones in different animals, and insects having kind of receptors where they can, I think it was flies having receptors made specifically for detecting a chemical that another male gives off, and it kind of induces male aggression in flies. And these kinds of like very direct pathways that just are like another unit of your species left a signal for you, and it's gonna like make you do something in response in these direct ways that are usually more like thought of as being associated with primary senses and not social behavior.
Yeah, I also appreciated that section too, because sometimes I find myself wondering if social stimuli are just hijacking the other, the sensory pathways. But this was a good reminder that no, there's actually unique pathways that are utilized for social stimuli, or they're different enough that they have
or maybe even co-evolved, right? I mean,
yes, exactly, yes.
I mean, so people talk about this sometimes in the context of like facial recognition, that like features of the face perhaps have evolved to become salient, and people have perhaps evolved to be able to detect, other faces, or in the case of birds with, certain plumage displays or things like this, you could imagine something similar.
Yeah, they cite in one of these articles how infants kind of orient towards faces as early as something like 6 months. And at that point, their visual system is like pretty shit by most measures, but they have enough of a sensory system to be able to identify vague facial-like patterns and orient towards them more so than non-facial patterns, which suggests that there's something like pretty innate about that detection system. And the fact that we like see faces in objects that aren't faces, if they just have like two holes and then like another half circle underneath it, you're just like, oh, that's a face.
Yeah. I wonder if animals have that too.
I just saw, I think there was some paper about that where monkeys do show a similar effect for things that look like faces. So, yeah.
Yeah, maybe mice. So many social experiments behaviors are reduced to, well, the mouse is exposed to urine smell, right? And so it's almost like an attempt to control the experiment.
So for context, I mean,
let me give some context to that.
Social.
Yes, exactly. So the equivalent of like, well, we respond in a social. Our brain responds as if it was a social stimulus, even though it's like a line and two points and a line. Perhaps more rudimentary animals have something similar because in some experiments they use urine. Mice don't really see that well, but they smell really, really well. And the way they identify animals from each other is essentially with the pheromones that exist in their urine, their pee. So a neural response to the pee is distinct and social, and it's considered like social cue.
And is there that's called the vomeronasal system, or there's a separate system? It's like there's certain receptors that pick up on these pheromone proteins, and it's processed slightly different than normal olfaction. Like they have direct paths to subcortical areas and that kind of thing. So this is like this direct idea that it's like an immediate sensory input that goes into some important brain area, and it's meant to be purely social.
Exactly, yeah.
And there is, in fact, like certain visual cues do have analogous things.
Like the facial stuff.
Yeah. I mean, just for more context on this, right? I mean, we sort of naively think of urine having a smell or visual patterns going through like a normal visual processing pathway, but like there are for some very specific things in the brain, there are sort of like shortcuts, and certain things like circadian rhythms also have this, where...
Yeah, I don't actually, now that I think about it, I don't know that I can think of evidence that face stimuli actually go through these kind of shortcut paths. I just know that they are detectable at an early age, and they're very like distracting stimuli. So that kind of suggests that maybe they do go through these shortcut paths, but I'm not
Actually,
sure.
There was I'm trying to remember in which...
one of the articles mentioned this.
In one of the articles, it's possible in the super long one, there was a line of one study that showed that within 50 milliseconds, people could tell if the picture was a social picture or an object, suggesting that it was bypassing the cortex, which I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, that's true, because that time scale would suggest that, yeah, it's going through some faster route. And like, as someone who studies vision, it's like, you know that facial stimuli are special. If you just want to have like a set of objects to use in a vision task, you can't just like throw a face in there, because it's going to be treated very differently than any other visual stimuli.
It's bigger than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah.
Which, I think big picture, since we are social animals and there are so many animals that rely on each other, it makes sense that the brain would co-evolve, systems for social stimulus and really quickly paying attention to other animals. So at least I can justify it from the big picture evolution.
And it's interesting, I guess it seems like in humans, there's not so much evidence for pheromone effects like those that are seen in mice, like this kind of separate pathway that picks up certain types of signals left by other people. Obviously, like, we can smell other humans and we can have thoughts about that, but that seems to work via the normal olfactory process that lets us smell anything else in the world. So that seems like perhaps a thing that's been faded out. I mean, humans, I guess, have not great smell compared to a lot of other animals generally, so it kind of makes sense that maybe we've switched to a more visual stimulus-based processing system, and that includes for social things as well.
Exactly. And then we stopped evolving for being better at smelling, because we just were so good at seeing that perhaps smelling was more troublesome. I don't know. But it is true that our olfactory bulb is minuscule when you consider the ratio of the rest of the brain compared to rodents that have a huge, like the percent, I wish I had a number, but the ratio of the size of the olfactory bulb in a mouse and in a rat is much bigger than our olfactory bulb to the rest of our brain. In a sort of similar way with what happens with primates and the visual cortex, right? Like the ratio of visual cortex to the rest of the brain is much larger than any other animal that I can think of.
Yeah, it takes up a lot, for sure. Another example that was kind of surprising to me was this social touch example. And they say that basically there are touch pathways that, you have touch receptors in your skin, and certain types of like soft caressing that we would associate with pleasant social touch. I guess the activation of those fibers releases oxytocin, and they also said that in people who have a disease where those fibers lose their myelination, so they lose their like protective coating and they can't work very well, people can still sense that they're being touched in like a pleasant way, but they can't localize the touch. They don't know where on their body it's coming from. They just get some input that says like pleasant touch is happening, which suggests that this is like an important social cue that's being preserved, even if like the specifics of the message are kind of getting degraded.
So they still get the sensation even if they can't identify.
Yeah. And so they associate this kind of role of social touch with the fact that primates tend to have social grooming and these kinds of things. So it's like, a way to signal perhaps your social like role or your place in the social hierarchy, and just get information about, how people are treating you via social touch. So yeah, so that's kind of the these immediate bottom-up fast social processing that can use, the same systems that we use for other things, but also can sometimes have more direct paths. And then the next two categories are these more high-level things that require kind of doing further processing on those bottom-up inputs. So, as we said, social cognition, things like theory of mind and moral judgment.
Just sort of as a framing, I found that people were including such, in my opinion, kind of lofty and somewhat broad topics as part of social neuroscience specifically, almost an interesting, like, sociological thing. The fact that, like, these articles, more than many articles in neuroscience, cited philosophers directly or quoted Wittgenstein or, and
what do you think that means? Yeah, what?
I don't know. The ambition or scope of what's intended to be covered is broader, or if the topics, in order to even clearly articulate what, when you're talking about these sort of social things, to even like, it becomes more of a challenge or sort of an open difficulty to even frame what you mean by studying certain subtopics. There's a large field of people who study language in general in linguistics and in philosophy and in neuroscience. So they touch on those fields. But here in the sort of realm of social neuroscience, you have to sort of, to some extent, deal with like complicated philosophical abstractions like the self versus the other, and
certainly in these more higher order facilities that they're talking about in a lot of the human work.
Exactly. In the sort of, we've touched upon, what we were just discussing was this sort of a lot of the bottom-up stuff that's like very conventionally neuroscientific. Like, what are the sort of pathways by which certain stimuli get to the brain, and maybe a little bit about like what parts of the brain process those stimuli. But the sort of, you get to something, as soon as you start asking questions, how do you study how one organism interacts with another organism of the same species? You have to start doing things that are a bit more complicated in terms of defining behaviors and defining what those interactions even look like.
Yeah, the thing that they focus on a lot is the idea that you use these bottom-up stimuli to infer kind of latent variables about another being. So like the mental state of someone else. You can see someone's face, not only does that tell you who that person is, but it's probably going to tell you something about their emotional state, because facial expressions convey emotion. And so you're doing this process of kind of guessing the internal state of another person. And once you get into that realm of like internal states and latent variables, you're beyond what can be measured easily in the lab in a certain way. And so
Exactly.
I think it does rely more on these vague or high-level concepts.
I guess what maybe strikes me as particularly difficult about this is science depends so heavily on the ability to measure things. And so part of what has always struck me for as long as I've been aware of social neuroscience as particularly
so
difficult.
for like half an hour now?
No. Like, you know, I've heard of it as I've been educated about neuroscience more broadly, right? And part of what's struck me as sort of difficult about studying social phenomena is defining the social phenomena and measuring all of the relevant variables, right? People, in order to study things scientifically, you want to be able to measure as much as you can about the setting and the situation. And so, you know, we've talked about the technical difficulty of measuring multiple brains at the same time, and there are cool shortcuts you can take to get around that to some extent. And but as this advances, I'm sure people will want to do that directly more and more. But you have to measure the behavior of both organisms. Mm-hmm. You have to sort of know. You have to believe you can know. You have to be able to make, you know, clear assumptions that get at what do you think the different organisms mean when they're doing certain things to each other.
Yeah.
You know, like intention comes into it, and sort of beliefs that one organism has about the other get into it, and so it becomes very complicated. It feels
also separating what's the social, what are the organisms that are interacting doing because it's a social interaction, and what are they doing because it unrelated, the context, you know, like isolating the social from the rest of what's going on. I think that's also really challenging.
Yeah, I think that problem makes sense in terms of experimental design. Like, what is the animal going to respond to something in the environment that isn't the other animal? And if so, like, I want to minimize that if I'm trying to study social interaction. There was a weird kind of theme in one of these that was about trying to like make the point that social neuroscience is special and separate from other types of neuroscience. And I didn't understand that in terms of like studying it in the brain. It seems like it's not necessarily, it doesn't require a fundamentally different approach. The stimuli you're using are different in a way, but I don't know that it's fundamentally different, or that you should expect to find like a subset of the brain that is exclusively social. I think it uses all of the areas of the brain that are necessary, and it probably does overlap in many respects. I mean, the fact that we kind of use analogies to talk about people, or the idea of like something that comes up is like predicting behavior or predicting things about social interactions, and we predict things about non-social things as well, and why not like use similar brain areas if they're useful? It seems like you shouldn't expect social neuroscience to be super special.
Yeah, perhaps this review does try to bring the point of it is interdisciplinary, you know, more unique than other types of fields. I think that I can easily disagree with them at the level of perception, for sure. Well, in a way, actually, you know, to respond better to your point, there's definitely unique pathways to process the stimuli, as we were just talking about, you know, like the pheromones in animals, the face patch in the primates. And once that stimuli has been interpreted as social, then it does, I agree with you, Grace, that it should converge with the rest of the brain, because it's just like decision making and evaluating and then motor planning, I guess. So I personally, I am treating it as the same as the other fields of neuroscience, and then just my stimuli is different. But it's more complex, right? Like the stimuli is, because that social being on the other side is it's not just social stimulus, but it's also moving and it's also doing things. So it's definitely a multisensorial and unique stimulus when it's another organism that's the stimulus.
Yeah, and I think that it kind of relates to what we were talking about, this like kind of reliance more on philosophy or psychology in terms of like describing things, because it's so complex and because the experimental field hasn't been around for that long. I feel like there hasn't been time for social neuroscience to like narrow down its focus and to come up with like a strict vocabulary for what it's studying and that kind of thing. And so it's relying a lot on social psychology, which has existed for longer, and it just has more high-level questions. Like the pieces that we read were overviews, and they kind of explicitly said, like, this is what we think, people should be thinking about moving forward. These are, like, suggestions for the future. There isn't so much of, like, here's, like, the bulleted list of facts that we've learned and, like, concepts that we've developed. I think it's just partly just because it's new and because it's complicated, and it's new because it's complicated, so...
Which is to just say that it hasn't been around for that long because it's technically difficult and conceptually also.
There was this kind of idea of, like, a desire to kind of list all the brain regions that are involved in different parts of social cognition. So I have some examples. The superior temporal sulcus is linked to the detection of biological motion, so like the motion that agents and other species would make rather than just like the wind. The medial prefrontal cortex and midline cortical structures are related to perspective taking as well as self-related processing and awareness. The temporal pole and amygdala to social scripts, emotions, and judgments. So those are just some examples of like these kind of associations people have come up with, and I think that there's a temptation to read into those things maybe more than should be done, but then at the same time, it also seemed like the people who were writing these reviews were like skeptical of that as well, and like they noticed that there should be a push more towards like process questions, like how does this turn into this, or how does this behavior happen, rather than just like correlating.
Where?
Yeah, like this area goes with this kind of thing and so on. So I mean, I think this is, again, it's something that comes from limitation of technique and like, being early on in the field. Like first you kind of, make the map, you like lay out the land, and then you can like do more interesting things with those things, hopefully.
Yeah, I think this is definitely a consequence of like how, well, I wanted to say like, that's how, in a way, brain science started, right? Like people had lesions of these particular brain regions, and then scientists and medical doctors notice, oh, there's a deficit in this, so we are biased to want to find where before we even know what or how. Yeah.
Sorry?
Wait, Grace, but does that mean that you don't agree with them that there is a social part of the brain that's unique to the rest of the brain, or at least a social system in the brain?
I don't think, my guess is that you will not find an area of the brain that is exclusively involved in social interaction.
But what about a system?
Well, a system seems even less likely, I guess.
Well, to say a system, it depends on what you mean. If you mean like some sort of distributed set of different brain regions that act in a certain coordinated way, I feel like that's almost a vague enough notion to begin with that it's like...
Sure.
Yeah, of course. You'll find a system that relates to anything that an organism does, probably, if you mean system in that sense.
Because reading these reviews was not the first time. Like this social brain, quote unquote, term is thrown around and is very heavily utilized by a social field of the study of behavior. So it's interesting to hear that you guys don't really see eye to eye with that pursuit of the understanding of the social brain.
I mean, this isn't specific, again, a way in which social neuroscience is not unique, this criticism is not unique to social neuroscience, I don't think.
Everything that...
Yeah, because I mean, I think this comes more from fMRI research just because of some of the limitations of the technology. So it happens in the study of attention. You have like attention networks, and what that refers to is certain sets of brain areas that kind of change their activity in coordinated ways, and you can call that a system. I don't know that it's super explanatory or mechanistic. It's just saying like these areas seem to be involved, and I'm sure you can find a set of areas that are in the way that they move together are unique to social situations, but I'm just saying I can't imagine that social things are so unique that they have like their own completely separate processing system.
I mean, as this discussion is going on, I was thinking about also in the second article, it gets discussed a bit more about mirror neurons and mirror neuron system how there's at least overlap in the sort of activation that you see in the brain between engaging in a behavior and observing another person engage in or perform some behavior. And I mean, even at the level of speech, when you listen to someone, motor articulatory regions of the brain will be activated in a way that reflects, either thinking about how you would say similar things or thinking about what you would say in that circumstance. So, I mean, while there's a lot going on there, and I don't want to oversimplify it.
That's true, but do you want to define mirror neurons for our listeners?
Mirror neurons were discovered in 2001, and basically they're these individual neurons in the premotor area of the brain. They were found in monkeys, and they they become more active when you or the monkey observes someone performing a certain action, like picking up a tool or like moving food to their mouth, something like that. And they respond the same when they observe someone else do that and when the animal does the movement itself. And so the idea is that they're kind of representing this action regardless of who is doing the action. And I think the findings, this has been picked up by popular science and by a lot of different researchers, and they've kind of expanded the definition of them and said that they're involved in a whole bunch of things. But I think the most robust findings regarding actions of single neurons is that it has to be goal-oriented behaviors. So it's not just if you flail your hands around or something like that it'll be the same. It has to be these kind of individual units of action that achieve some sort of minor goal.
So the implication is that it has to do both with sort of interpreting what the viewed organism is doing and also kind of knowing how what they're doing is related to what you might do if in a similar situation or something like that.
Yeah, and so one of the findings that kind of further suggests that it's about a goal is that about half of these cells will still fire even if they see the initiation of some very common action, and then the end point is kind of blocked off by the person picks something up and moves their hand behind a wall or something. It's the idea is that it's signaling the intent of this goal-directed movement, and that's what's in common.
I mean, this to me is a clear link between social neuroscience and sort of individual neuroscience, where an individual organism engaged in some activity or task or whatever, and when you're trying to study that organism in isolation, you can sort of see a connection to the ways that they could learn when watching other agents or interpret other agents.
Yeah, and I think one of the reviews cites that these things can this mirror neuron system is plastic, and people like dancers who have a lot of experience watching people and imitating them kind of have different effects in this area and are better able to mimic people, obviously. So it's kind of a system that exists to allow you to mimic people or mimic other members of your species, and then it can be expanded on in certain circumstances.
So then, Josh, just to make sure I understood your point, was the way you see social behaviors is as an extension of the behaviors that one individual could do. And in a way, mirror neurons are sort of an evidence for that. It's look, the brain of that person is interpreting the behavior. It's the same set of neurons that would fire if the animal or person was doing that behavior is the same sort of neurons that fires if the other animal or person is doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that this at least is a space where there's a connection between studying an individual versus studying multiple interacting organisms.
It feels simple. Yeah, it feels simple and sweet in a way to my ear to hear. It's oh yeah, it's just an extension.
But I don't know which one we want to think of as primary, right? So the second article had this thing about defining the word Ubuntu, which is also the Linux operating system, of course, right? But
do you remember the definition?
I do not remember. Can you quote the definition?
Ubuntu means that a person becomes a person only through other people.
What is the language it's from?
Bantu, African Bantu language.
I think it's ironic that the Linux operating system is named after that, because I think like Ubuntu is a very solitary experience for me when I'm using my
so people
computer.
just
I'm
using
not
it,
interacting.
but people collaboratively producing Ubuntu, right? I mean, it was,
on their end maybe.
Yeah, that's But so right. I mean, if I get a little bit fuzzy, I would say it's not clear whether we should say like the primary thing is social interaction, and studying individual organisms is studying a sort of decontextualized individual, not in the context of other things. I mean, I think scientists like to look for, and I would throw myself in this, like to look for sort of simple things. So it's in some ways nice and aesthetically pleasing for us to say like, oh yeah, the simple thing is like one organism. That organism in isolation is sort of primary, and we can also study them in the context of their interactions with other organisms as a social phenomenon. But
this feels again to me like the question of like, is there like a social neuroscience system in the brain or something? It feels like a little incoherent. It's like humans are individuals and they have social interactions. And
so
you can
both,
study them as
like
you can take one away from the crowd and do stuff to it and try to understand it, and you will understand something about it. If you can put it in a room with another individual, you might understand a little bit more, but the same problem that comes up in a lot of different types of science is that it's harder to study more complex things. And
because there's more variables.
Yeah, there's more variables, and especially in this, the whole reason that you would want to put two people in a room isn't just to have another person in the room. Like, in a lot of psychology experiments, there is another person. There's like the grad student running the experiment who comes in and explains the task to the person. So there's technically like a social element to all of these psychology studies. The reason that you'd want to actually just observe two people interact is because there's kind of uncertainty and complexity, but that uncertainty and complexity is terrible for doing science because you can't have a controlled experiment.
Or you're looking for, I mean, so there's references in this literature as well to things like behavioral economics and sort of social experiments. I mean, that's in some sense like purely social psychology rather. I mean, though you can do some of these same experiments.
Like if you want to understand cooperation or competition.
Yeah, so you're looking to understand, let's say, some like, let's use the term emergent phenomena that only exists through the interaction of people. In some ways, often in science, you actually stop studying the constituent parts when you study those. So like, if you want to study cooperation, you're often going to stop looking at the details below the level at which cooperation is sort of the relevant thing.
Certainly it's hard to, I think, to justify doing a brain scan of someone while trying to understand, like large-scale cooperation. I think.
Well, I mean,
they do a game, that's a very good, common experiment. Like, they're playing a game and they can be competing or they choose to cooperate.
And you want to understand, like, what brain regions are implicated in, motivate, like, people being motivated.
I totally understand, like, to do that for social neuroscience. I don't think I understand to do that for, economics or these other higher level things. Yeah, but people do. I mean, there is neuroeconomics where these kinds of cooperation versus competition studies are done, and they make connections between brain areas involved in those kinds of switches between different modes or your feelings towards a person that you're competing with and that kind of thing. And I'm a little suspicious of the benefit that the brain scan has when you're trying to understand the economy.
I mean, this kind of hits at this though directly, which is like basically due to complexity, but also not just complexity of the system, but also technical difficulty. It feels appropriate in some ways to look at individuals isolated from social interactions in order to study them. And in some ways, like, social neuroscience is about kind of reversing or attempting to reverse that tendency that maybe many in neuroscience, like, take as an assumption. Like, is it, like, in some sense, the sort of reification of social neuroscience is the asking of the question, is it appropriate to look at individuals in isolation, divorced from
interacting
with one another.
How
much are you learning, or are you making an unfair set of assumptions?
Exactly. It's like what we see in isolation, does it translate in the social scenario, which in reality life occurs unless you live in a mountain and you're alone, right? Most of your life occurs in a social context. So it is true that in a way we started with the assumption that we can study the brain in isolation. Now, because of technical developments and now we actually can potentially scan two brains at once, study two animals at once, monitor them better. Now I agree with Josh, like now we are able to ask the opposite question. It's like, well, what the assumption we made, was it real?
So we can talk about some of the studies where they have been measuring two brains at one time with people interacting. Yeah.
Seems like the most common way to measure two people is that they're playing a game together. And when they're competing, there's less synchrony than when they're cooperating, even if they're not talking to each other and even if like the contextual cues are all the same. So I think that for me, that's the most interesting phenomena that has emerged from that field of, well, let's measure the two brains at once. And then once you measure the two brains, then you can see if there's any type of coupling or any type of activity in one brain that relates to the activity in the other brain.
Yeah, so maybe let's also lay down some of the technical difficulties here. So presuming that you're doing this with humans, it has to be a non-invasive method, which kind of leaves you with things like fMRI or EEG. And one of the issues is the time scale, because these like social interactions can happen on very fast time scales. They were talking about how you can have dramatically different facial expressions over the course of a tenth of a second. And so there's kind of like a need to be monitoring both the brains at a high temporal resolution, which fMRI doesn't allow. So people do tend to use EEG, which has better temporal resolution but worse spatial resolution. So you're just getting kind of these like large summed signals across the brain as these two people are interacting, but then that gives you like a good signal to look for things like synchrony in different frequencies.
So what do you think about that stuff, Josh? I know that you usually have strong opinions, so I'm interested.
Yeah. So there's another part of this literature that's not just about games, but about communication between, two people or two animals, and synchronization of the brains to some extent when the individuals are communicating with one another. And I mean, some of this is sort of in some way straightforward. Like, and I mean, I don't know. For me to think about this, it actually helps to start with vision. So like, I won't digress too far, but just to say like, it's a non-obvious thing, right? That like, if you flicker lights at a person, part of their brain just starts going active and inactive with the flickering of the light, right? It's just
like at the same frequency.
At the same frequency.
Almost synchronized to the stimulus, right? Like if you flicker a light, the part of the brain is going to synchronize to that stimulus.
And also like if it starts being kind of a little bit non-periodic, right? It doesn't have to be just a fixed frequency, right? But it's like your brain,
it tracks the stimulus.
It's tracking the stimulus, right? And so it's not totally predictive. It's like
follows,
it's just following it. And I think in the case of when you break it down, like, so this is also true, like to some extent, there are parts of the brain where when you speak, the neural activity tracks the envelope of the waveform that you're producing, roughly. And this is true when you listen to waveforms in the sort of speech range as well, right? Part of your brain will sort of become active, and its activation profile will look like the waveform of the sound you're hearing. So sort of in this like, what to me is like almost trivial. Like I don't want to minimize it, but it's like It's like if I speak to you, parts of our brains will be moving at the same frequency because I'm speaking and part of my brain is correlated with the waveform of my speech, and you're listening to me, and so part of your brain is correlated with the waveform of your speech. And like you take a whole bunch of things that are in some ways to me non-obvious, like that sensory signals can drive neural activity and make the neural activity follow it, or when you're speaking, some of it like is being driven by your neural activity. And so you've got like this set
of things that were discovered using individuals in like a non-social neuroscience setting.
And so this is all somehow straightforward. But then like you can make the sort of jump to a statement that to me, like decontextualized, is actually very hard to parse, which is like when two organisms are interacting, you see that their brains are correlated. And like I want to know, well, is it that they're paying attention to the same things in the environment? Is it that one is driving the other, because it's like doing something that the other's attending to? And so somehow it's like almost like the measuring of the correlations between their brains is like the least interesting part. Like the fact that their two brains are correlated, I don't know how much that tells me, other than like the two organisms are engaged in something participative.
Well, that's the confusing thing, is that so something that came up in these papers, especially the last one on brain-to-brain coupling, I think, was like these studies where they have people watch the same movie and they record signals from their brain, and then they say things about how aligned the brains were. And I mean, that's more or less a way to do non-social neuroscience. If you're just interested in like how do people process movies, you would show a bunch of people the same movie and then figure out like kind of what's common to the processing of it. Yeah. So there is a weirdness, like when does it start to count as social neuroscience, and what can you attribute to anything being social or just about experiencing the same stimulus? I
mean, I think there's like I've heard in the context of like a neuromarketing kind of thing, where like one example would be like, oh, well, if like there's a sequence in a movie that everyone's brains synchronize to the same way, or in a commercial or something like this, then it implies that somehow like that stimulus is captivating.
Yeah, everybody paid attention to it. At least I would interpret it that way.
Yeah, that's the general interpretation, is that everyone's like attending to the same stuff.
Sure, but that's no different than
I agree. Yeah. So if you do simple, like, I mean, the extreme version of this is you do a simple neuroscience experiment where like, people are looking at a blank screen and occasionally there's a picture of a face that's on for half a second. And like, it'll be the case that there'll be a similar brain region in most people that lights up when the face is on, right? That's like a standard paradigm for an individual neuroscience experiment. It's just like what brain is what brain area. I mean, slightly more complicated version of this would be used to say when, what brain region is involved in the processing of faces for individuals, and you would average it across individuals to say this is the brain region across individuals. So for this notion of synchrony across individuals when they're engaged in something, it depends on what the cause is. And so if one organism is driving the other organism, then there's something potentially interesting, but I don't quite know how interesting it is. It's like interesting that one organism can drive the other organism and that their brains are, as a consequence, correlated in some way. But it's not totally clear to me that when one organism drives another organism, it means something deeper than there's some intermediary, like the waveform of their speech or something going on in the physical space. And
also, I think there's a temptation to be like, oh, well, it's not just the waveform of the speech, like that's too reductionist. Like there's a whole holistic experience of like seeing someone speak, and like there's all these nonverbal cues or whatever. But that's still the same idea. It's just this person is producing a physical stimulus in the world that is now entering the sensory processing system of the second person. And in that way, it's not different from anything else that produced a physical stimulus in the world. It happens to be like a very high-dimensional, complicated one, because people have like a lot of different facial muscles and can make a lot of different, small signals. But it's still the idea that this person is just producing something that the other person is then taking in.
Yeah, so just to comment on the same, is this phenomena interesting or meaningful beyond, well, we're looking at the same thing or we're experiencing the same thing, therefore our brains, they have common patterns of activity that are a simple consequence of what we're experiencing. So I read a lot of papers last year, and I will go related to this topic of cross-brain coupling, which is sort of like how people relate to it. because brain-to-brain coupling is like, or cross-brain coupling seems to be like the way that social cognition, or just like the cognition field, seems to be reporting this. Because I was fascinated, because like I couldn't find, it's almost like, you know, there's the cognition people were studying this, but nothing reflected this type of consideration in the neuroscience world. So I was like fascinated by like, did this connect? Because we do look at cross-regional coupling, so it's not like the idea of coupling is new. So I was like, why? Is this something that everybody's missing? Nobody knows that people do this with humans, and what does it mean for like animal research? So I stopped trying to decide if it's meaningful or not, but from the perspective of the animal world, one of the challenges is that you don't know when animals are paying attention to each other. So in my personal work, I've decided that I am glad that I encountered this literature, because I am doing social experiments, and I do have the capabilities of recording from both animals at the same time. So I'm actually, I have in some of my goals include to use the cross-brain coupling as a measurement of attention, a potential measurement of like the mice are actually paying attention to each other or not, right? So
yeah, I think that's a compelling use case, because you've operationalized the notion of
exactly. Instead of saying, is it meaningful? Why is it happening? My challenge is, are these mice paying attention to each other? And because I can't ask them, right? So
yeah, and that seems in line like with the findings. Like there was one of the studies was looking at people talking to each other and showing, you know, these kinds of synchronies that happen when people are talking to each other, but they stop happening when the speaker is speaking a language that the listener doesn't understand. So presumably that's like the person's no longer paying attention because they couldn't if they wanted to even. Yeah, and so it seems like this is like a reasonable signal of like how engaged the two people are. Are they paying attention to each other?
Yeah. So I'm going to use it I'm currently using it as a tool for measuring attention or engagement. I'll let you know if it works in the future. Don't know yet.
Cool.
Are there any other things we want to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still, as I sort of look over the scope of what's going on here, it does feel to me that it, as Grace pointed out, it isn't so separate from much of neuroscience, and it slightly confuses me generally that there's a sort of attempt to make this as separate as it feels like the push in all of the articles that we read and other things that I've encountered. But I mean, maybe that's just part of the tendency for different academics to try to articulate what makes their topic different or particularly interesting. And I mean,
it could be a marketing tool of science.
Yeah.
And we didn't talk about, I mean, at least to motivate the reason to study these kinds of things, there are a lot of clinical applications for this. I mean, there are like mental health issues that relate to social interactions and that kind of thing.
I mean, there are mental health issues that relate to like every question in neuroscience.
Yeah, I'm somewhat sympathetic to the argument that social things are even more
interesting. Okay.
They're more damaging.
Yeah, don't
you think?
Like that's kind of the and they point out like there are things where the disease itself is an impairment of social processing, things like autism or schizophrenia, or like there are also just a lot of disorders have symptoms that are about socialness. You know, you don't want to interact socially if you have other problems.
I see.
Not that we can fix anything. So I mean that's an argument to be like, it doesn't matter if there's clinical applications because it's so complicated, it's not clear we're going to be able to fix anything. But
so I mean it was partly just that given the reliance on philosophy and the fact that I wasn't convinced that it's so different from other parts of neuroscience, rather than try to separate out social neuroscience as like a thing, I mean other than just as like a subtopic, you know, my inclination would be to see these as sort of, you know, just in line with other questions. And I would almost rather the sort of imperative have been from social neuroscientists, like, yeah, like most neuroscience questions touch upon social elements, and we could kind of, everything is more related than you would have thought, rather than this is almost like a carving off a territory that's
no, the most engaging thing to me was the stuff that was making social neuroscience seem like any other part of neuroscience, like the findings about primary sensory inputs and the processing of that. It was like, oh, this is like totally like in line with other things about neuroscience and should be studied to an equal extent. And I was more, willing to
or
to hear
even
that
most
side.
of neuroscience will become more interesting as it gets more social, as we're able to measure more variables. Like
Yeah.
I guess, really what it comes down to is if you're pushing for social neuroscience and you're pushing especially for things like dual brain recordings, this is such a more burdensome methodology that you need to like promise something big and spectacular, I think. There's no way to like motivate people to do double fMRI recordings that they have to now align the timing of perfectly if you're not going to tell them that they're going to learn something much bigger than they could learn just from the individual ones.
Well, I think it will be much bigger, but I don't know if it's going to be qualitatively separate, or in the way that maybe the framing of this tried to push itself as.
I just want to be the devil's advocate here, and it's possible that because of our background, this is what we're interpreting, what these other social scientists wrote, but it might be like where we're looking from. We're looking from this neuroscience, like systems world, and observing and judging this, but they might be coming from a different angles completely. So,
well, I mean, these people were neuroscientists,
but they are coming from a more psychology perspective.
Yes,
certainly.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and the social sciences as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nancy, thank you very much for joining us again. It was lovely as always.
Yeah, it was awesome.
Thank you.
Till next time.
Next time. Bye.
Hey, if you're still listening to this, you must really like us. So how about you go to iTunes or Stitcher and rate the podcast, give us some feedback. You can also go to our website, unsupervisedthinkingpodcast.blogspot.com. You can comment on different episodes, or you could give us ideas for new topics you want to hear about. We would love to hear from you. Thanks.